Welcome home, where we provide information, inspiration, and motivator after motivator after motivator here on America's Next. I have Tony Hynes here with me today. How you doing, Tony?
I'm doing well. Cedric. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you tonight. Everybody out there, I want to say thank you for tuning in, whether you be on Roku TV, Apple TV, Android TV, Facebook, or YouTube. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to us that you're here tonight. Feel free to drop a comment in the chat if you have something to say or question even, and we'll put it on the screen. Your reactions mean a lot in these episodes. If you like what we're talking about, hit the thumbs up, put different emojis in the chat. All these sorts of things let Facebook know that what we're doing is valuable. So definitely participate. One more thing I gotta let you guys know. I will be drinking water on tonight's episode. And also my cheek looks a little swollen because I got some cough drops because I got a scratchy throat. So I won't be doing the usual dynamic of conversation, but I'll do my best. Tony, where you from?
I'm from Washington, D.C.
Okay. Did you grow up there?
I didn't. I would say that I didn't grow up there. I grew up in a place called Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is really on the outskirts of D.C. In Maryland. It's about 5 minutes from D.C. So I was born in D.C., but when I was adopted, I was actually raised in Tacoma Park.
Okay. How old were you when you got adopted?
So that's actually kind of a long story, Cedric. So when I get asked that question, I really start by telling people that I was obviously like everyone else. I was born, and I was born in Washington, D.C., and my birth mom happens to be schizophrenic. And so she wasn't able to care for myself, and she also wasn't able to care for my two sisters. And so for the first year or so of my life, I spent it with her, growing up, with her, being raised by her, and also sometimes with relatives as well. And what was going on during that time, Cedric, was that sometimes she was having trouble caring for me, even during that first year of life. And so she would go to orphanages, and she would leave me at orphanages for a weekend, and then she would come back at the end of the weekend, for example, and then she would care for me again.
Wow.
Well,
hold on.
Yeah.
Your mother would take you to the orphanage during the week?
Sometimes, yes. I don't want to make it seem like it was all the time, but sometimes, yes, that did happen. Okay. And what happened on one of those occasions was that she took me there, and then at the end of that time I was there, someone there said, you can either leave Tony here indefinitely, or you can take him home indefinitely, but you can't keep doing this back and forth. And so it was at that particular time that I stayed in an orphanage indefinitely. So I was about 1 year old when that happened. And I stayed in an orphanage until I was about 3 years old. And it was really at that particular time that I was matched with two individuals, two women, two white women, two gay white women who wanted to adopt me. But first, they became my foster parents. So from the ages of 3 for me to the age of 5, my two moms, Mary and Janet, were actually my foster parents. And it was really at the age of 5 that I was adopted. So I was adopted at 5, and the adoption went through like adoptions do. However, around 3 months after that initial adoption took place, it was overturned by a panel of 3 judges who determined that a white same-sex-headed household was not the right household for a Black child to grow up in. And so that adoption was overturned. My mom's appealed that decision all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it was knocked down to the lower courts, who decided upon a joint custody agreement. So technically, I was adopted, and then I wasn't adopted. I became a ward of the state, technically, at that time, but one who was living with Mary and Janet still at that time.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a powerful American story. Please tag somebody, text somebody, get somebody else in the conversation, because tonight We're in for the story of Tony Hynes, and the details that you're sharing right now are they're making my mind go into a few different directions. The humanity on the part of your mother to say, I need help. I understand that I'm not perfect. I deal with this thing called schizophrenia. And so I'm going to take my child to the orphanage. You know, some people with schizophrenia are painted as individuals who do nothing that makes sense. And so you seem to have landed in the home, or was placed in the home of two loving women, and then your reality was changed again when that was undone. What I'm wondering is how many people clear across America can identify with parts of your story already. Who out there is an infant or a toddler or a teenager with a mother who has a mental health challenge, or is adopted, or is in foster care, let alone those parents being of the opposite race, and that they are two of the same sex parents. This is like the entire mix of America well, not the entire mix, but a lot of the mix of America that you were experiencing early in your life. All those different dynamics.
Yes, Cedric, exactly. So the foster care system, growing up in a one-parent home for a little while, being in the home of relatives for a little while as well. When I was living with my mom, yes, but also living with relatives from time to time, specifically my grandmother in that particular way. And so there's a story of mental illness that goes along there as it relates to my birth mom, who is schizophrenic. There's a story of the interracial piece there. So how many of our listeners grew up with white mom, black dad, vice versa, grew up with one parent who was another race from another parent, grew up looking different than one of their parents racially? Well, that was my experience as well, growing up with two white parents in the home. And then, of course, the LGBTQIA plus piece there as well, with growing up with two women who were lesbian as well, and growing up in that household. And, you know, I should remind our listeners at home that I was growing up in the 1990s. So now I wouldn't say that you go outside and you see a family with two moms and a son, and that it isn't a family structure that you might not do a double take on, but it's something that we have become more used to seeing. We see it more on television, right, than we had in the past. But in the 1990s, when I was growing up, my particular family structure wasn't something that we normally saw. That's and right. So growing up, that was also unique, but in some ways, at different points in time, it was uniqueness that brought upon unique challenges as well. Every family goes through challenges, and our challenges were unique because our family was unique.
Yes, I'm hearing that everybody had to work through certain obstacles in order to be a family. There were and I want to talk a little bit about potential pushback. Was there pushback from your biological family as you were adopted and you actually moved away from your biological family? What was that like? Do you remember any of it?
I do. So, you know, most adoptees, I should say a lot of adoptees grow up, and they grow up not even really knowing who their birth family is. And if they do know who their birth family is, they don't get a chance to interact with their birth families. That was not the case in my particular scenario. I grew up and I was able to interact with my birth family often. So with that joint custody agreement, it stipulated that I was going to see my birth family really every week or so. So I would go over to my grandmother's house and I would spend the day there. And once in a while, I would actually spend the night there as well. And my cousins would normally be there. One of my sisters would normally be there as well. Once in a blue moon, my mom would also be there. My birth father was not there. And so I did grow up knowing them. And yes, to answer your question, there was pushback, right? Because there was an appeal of the adoption in the first place, and that appeal was done by members of my birth family.
Okay.
But I don't want to paint one side as the savior or one side as the villain in my particular scenario, because my birth family didn't have all the information that they should have had. They didn't, for example, have the knowledge to know that being raised in my particular household structure wasn't going to mean that I wasn't going to be around Black people, that I wasn't going to have Black friends in my life, that being raised by two gay women didn't mean that I was going to be gay myself, or that anything sexually deviant was going to go on in my household. They didn't know that because, one, they didn't know people who came from that type of ilk. Two, because they had been raised themselves, I think some of them to believe certain things about being raised in interracial households, maybe about how gay people might raise children. And they were not alone in that regard. And unfortunately, in our situation, the social worker in our case, my social worker, was actually feeding misinformation to my birth family. And so our social worker was saying, if you allow Tony to be adopted by these two white women, he'll never know what it means to be Black. He'll be gay himself, and that's codified as a bad thing.
This
right?
is what the social worker was saying?
Exactly. That's what our social worker was saying. And so I try to say, this is in the 1990s in Washington, D.C. It was rare for Black children to even be placed in white homes, period. Because the idea was that if Black kids are placed in white households, and they won't grow up to have positive senses of themselves as Black individuals. And unfortunately, we did see some of those things play out in the 90s and even in the 80s and even in the 70s for Black children that were placed in white homes, that were these kind of like colorblind households that didn't teach their children about their racial identities. It didn't teach them about not only Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but Fannie Lou Hamer and Medgar Evers and all of these other figures that were instrumental in what it means to be attached to the idea of the Black identity, but also to positive change and positive impact makers in history who also have been Black. And so it was important to understand and to acknowledge that for that social worker that we had. But they went, honestly, they took it to an extreme. They took it to a polar extreme where they said that there was an absolute there. If this person is placed in this household, they will be like this. This family is like this. And there wasn't conversation with us, with my moms, about, if you adopt him, how are you planning to raise him? Do you plan to have, we call them racial mirrors in his life, Black mentors in his life, even male role models in his life, etc.
That's right. People on all sides of your story, and we're still very early in your story, are just human. They are a sample of the American population. There are people out there in the world who are not up to speed about foster care. They're not up to speed about adoption in general. And if someone in their family gets placed in the foster care or the adoption scenario, it's their first time coming into the knowledge of this system with their own bias, perspective, and experience. And so we are in the month of May, which is a National Foster Care Awareness Month. And I believe that foster care, adoption, the whole child well-being space is a mirror to America. And so when we talk about, hey, what are the intricacies of your dealings with this child since you're of the other race, another race? I see that as relevant in a lot of different scenarios, whether it be in the classroom, whether it be, different organizations. I think we all need to have these conversations. We all need to have more education. We all need to have more experiences with one another. And so the people in your life are no different. They have questions, they have biases, they have resiliency. These two women who came into your life, they had to overcome the challenges as well of potentially taking you to a barbershop to get your hair cut, taking you into places where they've been with no child and now they have a child and the child looks nothing like them. And so everybody has had to, have this conversation that maybe they've never had before. And that's what I think makes your story so interesting. How is it that an adoption that went through was overturned in the same state?
Right. So this is DC, so it is rare for that to happen. But okay, if the birth family files an appeal of the adoption, the judge or judges in a case have a right to hear that appeal. And when they hear that appeal, if they decide that the appeal has merit, then they can make a decision to overturn that adoption. Okay. And it doesn't happen often, but it did happen in this case. And it did happen in this case on the basis of racialized lines and also sexualized lines as well, as it related to my case.
That's right. And I think it's all valid. The concerns are valid. The desire of a biological family to try to hold on however they can is valid. And your deservance of a stable and healthy future is valid as well. Can you talk to me about what it was like for you growing up in this household where you got adopted? What was it like? Were there racial mirrors? What was your experience like?
There were racial mirrors in my experience, but I wouldn't go on to say that the community I grew up in was so diverse when I was first growing up. It's pretty diverse now, but when I was growing up, the school that I went to was not very diverse. It was a predominantly white elementary school. I ended up having one of my best friends in that school, though, was Black. I had a couple of friends in the school who were different races, and I had some friends in school that were white. I was fortunate to have a family friend across the street who was a racial mirror for me. He was our neighbor, and he was a Black man, and he always gave me advice when he saw me. Even to this day, if I see him, he'll give me some sage advice on something. And so he was somebody I looked at and I looked up to in that way. And so, but doing that was something that my moms were aware needed to be done. They knew that even though I was growing up in a progressive household, that it was still important for me to have some male influence in my life, that it was still important for me to have racial mirrors in my life as well, that I could look up to, but also just share parts of who I was in a way that I couldn't necessarily share with somebody who didn't get my experience as a Black person in the United States in that way. So it's really about, as people, understanding the needs of those who we love the most, and then trying to create a supportive environment for those individuals. Now, my moms were not perfect. They made mistakes, but in many ways, they were kind of ahead of the curve of a lot of interracial adoptive families, a lot of white parents raising Black and brown children in the 90s, because they did understand that I needed to have those things in order to be supported in all the ways I needed to be.
And in today's world, there are a lot more same-sex couples that are adopting and fostering. And so you all could be seen as pioneers to a degree by making a commitment to build those relationships and help you, Tony, produce a positive life. Can you talk to me about what middle school was like for you? What was it like?
Middle school sucked. And I think that there will be a lot of people out there who empathize with that statement. as well, right? Whether you're growing up in an adoptive household, whether you're foster youth, former foster youth, or not, middle school sucked for a lot of us. And for me, it sucked because, I went to a very small middle and high school. I didn't know anyone going into the school, and I didn't have a lot of common interests. I was really into sports, and the other kids in my classes were not as interested in sports. I didn't really know how to start conversations and all that other stuff. But in my particular case, middle school was also very difficult because I had a tragedy befall me before I got to middle school. So I told the listeners that I grew up with two moms, and that's true. But one of my moms passed away when I was about to turn 12 years old, which was the summer before I went into middle school. So on top of just being this, regular middle school awkward kid, I was also grieving the loss of my mother. And, my mom that passed away, we shared so many similarities. Our personalities were similar. We were both extremely competitive. And she was taken away from us in a way that's unfair, in which a lot of listeners out there can, I'm sure, empathize with as well. In her particular case, she developed cancer and passed away. And so that also made my middle school experience different, because before I had two moms who were picking me up from school every day. I had two white people who were picking me up from school. And so in elementary school, sometimes people would ask me questions, why do you have two moms? Do they sleep in the same bed? To which I replied, don't your parents? But I also got asked other questions about, why are you a different race from your parents, plural? Mm-hmm. So because I only had one parent picking me up from school, I didn't get a lot of those questions, and I got different questions. So it allowed me to, in going into high school, it allowed me to cover a part of my identity that I hadn't been able to cover before, because I didn't have to tell people I had two moms anymore.
I understand what you're saying, the change of dynamics when you began to live in a one-parent household. It could be assumed that your father just wasn't around. But the reality is, in addition to what you're saying, that you were being flat out attacked or accosted by people's assumptions of what your life was, questions about what your life was. I mean, it sounds like it was coming from every direction. Why are your moms like this? Why do you have two moms? And it's like just a whole lot of conversations happening in your life while you have to focus on school. You have to focus on being positive, not being full of angst, dealing with angst, being productive in school and socially. That must have been really tough. And I don't want to downplay the fact that that sounds like a very tumultuous time in your life. A child, a teenager, having to account for, what's going on in your life, the adults who are coming to pick you up. And this at the same time where you probably value friendship. You value relationships, right? But part of your relationships is explaining why you have two white parents, or now one white parent. And if it's okay with you, we can use their names. We don't have to call them two white women for the duration of this show.
Their names are Mary and Janet. So
Mary and Janet.
You can use their names. Yes.
Mary and Janet. Yeah. And so, people have all these questions about Mary and Janet, and that's tough. I spent years of my life in foster care as well. Seems like, elementary school is 5 years. For me, middle school was 3. You have some friends who've known you for 7 years. And in that 7 years, there have been 4 or 5 different people peeking their head in the classroom to pick you up, saying, oh, I'm his mom. I'm here to pick him up.
Yeah, in my situation, especially by the time I got to 6th grade, because I went to school where it was K through 6, kindergarten through 6th grade. So that's 7 years right there.
Yep.
And so one of my moms, Mary, got sick when I was in the 1st or 2nd grade when she was diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And so she went in for her original chemotherapy treatments in 1997. And through about 1999, she was going through chemotherapy treatments. And so there was, during that time, one parent sometimes picking me up from school, but people kind of understood that I had two moms. But later into my academic elementary career is when she started taking more of a turn for the worse. And so she was in the hospital most of the time. And so it was really my mom, Janet, who was picking up the slack there and picking me up from school. So if we had new kids in school, they wouldn't know I had two moms. And to your point, if people did know me, then they knew that the dynamics had shifted and changed in a way. But our school was pretty tight knit. So pretty much everyone in the school actually knew that one of my moms had cancer. And so they were sending me baskets, and, you know, I was asked if I wanted to take off from certain homework assignments. And I don't want to make it sound like my situation is completely unique, because these are some of the challenges that the kids today are going through when you have a parent out there who is sick. My situation, it was unique in the sense with that dynamic change, though, after she passed away. Now there were new people who I didn't know, actually. There were new people who were getting to know me, who were starting to ask me questions about my familial environment, starting to ask, do you know where your dad is? Who's your mom, et cetera. And like you, kind of, it sometimes does feel, I don't want to say like an attack, but like an intense interview, like an interrogation sometimes. And as an adult, that's difficult, right, for us to process and navigate that. So for a child, it's even more difficult. So for adopted families now, what I do in my training specialty is I give parents and adopted families tools on how to respond to some of those uncomfortable questions that a lot of our families get. But yes, that dynamic shift was something that definitely impacted how I was thinking about myself, how I was thinking about my family, how I was thinking about my guilt too, right? Because I felt guilty at times, because there were times when my high school friends would say, that's so gay, or they would use the F word, the F word, the other F word, right? And I would feel uncomfortable when they used that word, but I didn't know if I should say, hey, stop using that, because then they might ask me about my family background, and then I might have to tell them, right? And if I told them, would they walk on eggshells around me then? Yeah. Would they be close-minded and not want to be friends with me? It would be easier in my mind, I thought at the time, just to not say anything. But in not saying anything, there was guilt associated with that for me, because I knew that I was hiding a part of who I was. I wasn't honoring my moms in the way that I should have been in that way. So there's lots of changes that happen with those dynamics when they get shifted as well.
As you entered into high school, had you began to tune out some of the noise or distractions and began to focus on the life that you were living with your mothers and with your mother? Had you began to focus a little bit more?
Well, I would say that there was never going to be a time when I was going to, and I know this wasn't your question necessarily, but there was never going to be a time, for example, when I was tuning out losing one of my moms. That was just always going to be something that was on my mind. I was going to think about her every single day. I was going to think about what my life would have been like without her. And in terms of tuning out those other parts as well, when I was in high school, I was still seeing my birth family. I wouldn't say every other week anymore, but I would see them on the holidays. I'm talking about every holiday, really. So I was seeing them still enough that I was thinking about kind of this sense of dueling loyalties that a lot of former foster youth, that a lot of adoptees feel around, who should I be loyal to, my birth family or my adopted family, or both? Both families don't seem to get along as well as I would like them to get along. And I was getting questions still from my birth family about, how is that experience in different ways? So there wasn't really an opportunity to tune it out. And then the other aspect of that is that when you go outside, everybody's used to being in their own body, usually, I shouldn't say always, but usually by the time they're in high school, you feel awkward in your own body, right? Your body is shifting and changing. But when you go out with your parents, you don't really think about it too much. But when you're an adoptee, especially when you're an interracial adoptee, when you go out with your parents, and this applies to people in mixed race families too, people sometimes stare at your family and they wonder what the relationship is. Who is this person as they apply to you? That part was something that by the time I got into high school, I had kind of tuned out. I had gotten used to the stares of people when my mom and I went out to get something to eat. But getting some of those questions, experiencing that grief, and also having those feelings of dueling loyalties between the birth and adopted family was something that was still definitely part of my, I don't want to say literally everyday experience, but part of my general experience as a person.
Mm-hmm. As you had to continue to manage through all of these conversations in your life, did you all have conversations in your home that allowed you all to develop a culture of resilience, a culture of empathy and understanding?
Yes, we did. And I think, for me, understanding who my mom was, my adopted mom Janet was, understanding who she was, and her understanding who I was important, because a lot of families will talk a lot, and that is good to do, and I encourage families to do that. Some of our coping mechanism after my mother Mary died was to get a bunch of cheap DVDs and to watch them, to watch our favorite shows. And we used to watch our favorite shows together. And that was something that was therapeutic for us. And I think helped us process everything that was going on. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that we had deep conversations all the time about everything that was going on in my life. But I think having a home in which I knew I was supported was something that helped me build resilience. And I tell this particular story sometimes. For example, at the time I was 15 years old, I was at the basketball court close to my mom's house. And I was playing up at the school. And then I remember seeing my ball, I missed a shot. The ball rolled down the hill. I ran to chase it down the hill. Then when I was going to get it, I remember looking up, and about 50 yards away from me, there was a police officer. And so I didn't know if they were walking towards me or not. So I just continued to walk down the hill to get my ball. And then by the time I got to my ball, I realized that the police officer was gaining on me, that he wasn't running, but he was walking towards me. So I kind of froze, but he didn't tell me to stop. And I started walking back up the hill, back to his blacktop. By the time I got back up to the blacktop, the police officer was almost standing there meeting me at that particular point in time. And it was at that particular moment that he hailed me and he told me to stop. So I stopped. And then he asked me, and I had this blue North Carolina basketball in my hand that I had won at a carnival, one of these oversized, bouncy basketballs in my hand. And he said, "What are you doing up here?" And I said, I'm playing basketball. I'm just shooting around. And he said, "Why are you up here by yourself?" And I said, "Well, my friends actually just left the court. I was doing homework that day, and I got up there a little bit after they did. This was before cell phones, so I didn't know they had just left the court when I got up there, but I still wanted to shoot around." And he said, "Okay, because we got a report that some kids were up on the school and they were stealing stuff, and they were on the roof of the school and they had stolen some stuff. Do you know anything about that?" And I said, "No, I don't know anything about that. I'm just up here." And at one particular point in time in the conversation, the police officer asked me, "Where do you live?" And I remember I had the basketball in my left hand over here, and I pointed and I said, "I live just down the street." And it was at that particular moment that he slapped the basketball out of my hand It bounced, and then it bounced up into his hands. He kicked the basketball, punted it really across the blacktop and across the adjoining field. And then he told me to get the F down on the ground. So I got down on the ground and he pointed his gun at me when I was down on the ground. So he was pointing his gun at me, had his gun drawn, and I noticed that there were 2 other police officers there. And then he said, stay the F down, and he continued pointing the gun at me. And I stayed on the ground with my face buried on the ground.
On a blacktop.
On the blacktop.
It was hot.
It was hot. It was hot. And it must have been about 20, 30 minutes. After 20, 30 minutes were up, he tells me that I can get up now. I stand up and he says, well, I'm sorry. Actually, he didn't apologize. He just said, it turns out that this was a case of mistaken identity and we got the wrong person. And then he went and he walked across the blacktop to get my basketball and he brought it over back to me. And he said, you know, I'm a really nice guy. They call me Officer Patty Cakes because of how nice I am. That's literally what he said to me. And then they left. The other 2 officers there didn't say anything. They left. I got the guy's badge number and I went and I told my mom, I told Janet what had happened. And when she heard what had happened, she was obviously a little shaken, but she went down to the police station and she told the police officers there at the police station that this was a use of excessive force and that this was wrong, that I was racially profiled. And the officers at the police station didn't listen to her. They didn't really believe her, and they said that this guy was a nice cop, that he wouldn't do something like that, that it was probably just a misunderstanding. And unfortunately, that's what his superiors felt about the situation. And so as with happens in America today, as we know, nothing was done to rectify that situation from an accountability standpoint for that officer. I never got really an apology even from that officer. But what it taught me was that my mom was willing to stand up for me and to support me in that moment. So even though we weren't the type of family who talked about things all the time, I knew that she realized how important it was for me in that moment to be supported as a Black man in the United States, and how important it was for her to try to protect me, even when in some ways she couldn't. It still felt protective. And so that's how you build resilience in children. You're in adults, in friendships. You know, you may not be in a situation where you're forced to go to a police station and interact in that particular way, but showing people that you're willing to fight for them, to sit with them in their pain and their uncomfort, those are things that strengthen not only your friendships and those relationships, but also things that help strengthen that individual, because they know when they're going through things that, well, I don't have to go through something by myself now.
That's right.
I have someone else who's there, or other individuals, plural, who were there to support me no matter what I go through. So that was definitely something that was helpful.
That's right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking to Tony Hynes. He has had a story that is worth listening to, visualizing, and understanding. I appreciate you all being here with us today. We're going to take a break. I don't want you guys to go anywhere because we're going to finish up in the second half of this segment when we return with Tony Hynes. Be right back. America's Next Motivator. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern. America's Next Motivator, hosted by me, Cedric Riley, sponsored by the Pride Empowerment Network and our viewership. And we're back. Hey, Tony, how you feeling out there?
Good, good. How you feeling, Cedric?
I'm feeling great, man. It's time to shake the room up a little bit. When you experienced that scenario with the police, did you have a moment where you thought, me and my mother, my moms, we're doing the best that we can together, but I am a black man in America, an African-American man in America, and I need to also understand what that means, not just in my household, but what society thinks it means for me to be a black man in America?
In that moment, I didn't think that, Cedric, to be honest with you. In the moment, I was wondering if I was going to die. I was wondering if the cops were going to pull the trigger. And that's because at that moment in time, I already understood what it meant to be a black man in the United States. My moms were not shy about teaching me about history and about the ugly parts of history as well. I was shown a picture of Emmett Till's battered face when I was 7 years old. You know,
Wow.
I remember when I was 9 years old, and I watched the news and I learned that Amadou Diallo, a man in New York City, was shot over 20 times by the police. And I was aware of the KKK and Nazis. So I actually grew up, especially when I learned these things, 6, 7, 8 years old, fearing for my life and for my family's life. I thought that, well, they seem to hate black people and they hate gay people too. And they hate mixed race families too. These racists out there.
Well, hold on. I love it that your parents had already prepared you for a scenario such as this. How did they do it? How did they present the conversation? How did it go? So that we can provide insight to other families who are in a similar scenario.
Exactly. You know, it's a very important point. So in my particular family, my moms were really big on books and giving me literature to read. So the picture of Emmett Till that I saw was on kind of this card book thing. And it was a card book that was about black people. And it was about black people in the United States in the century so far. And so I was kind of flipping through the card book, and then I found a picture of Emmett Till in the card book. And the picture in the card book of Emmett Till was a picture of, unfortunately, the face that some of us have seen after he's been killed, and which is his battered, bruised face. And so I learned about Emmett Till that way. I learned about the civil rights movement in the United States through watching this TV series called Eyes on the Prize that was a famous series in the 80s and in the 90s. There was a documentary on the civil rights movement in the United States. Both of my moms were very interested in history, but also in equality. And they were interested in talking to me about the importance of treating others the way that you wanted to be treated. And they were not people who shied away from sharing the history and sharing the sometimes racist history of different aspects, not only the United States, but of the globe in general. And so those were things that I grew up learning about.
So you felt prepared to grow into a powerful black man and a powerful man in society upon graduation in college and as you left the nest.
I did, but I would be lying as well if I said that I didn't have questions about the racial authenticity piece. So it's one thing to know about Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer, like I said, and Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, James Baldwin. It's another thing to know how to do a proper dap with someone when they come up to you, right? To know how to do, and that's a handshake.
So
in that way.
So this is why I asked you, after you had that encounter with the police, did you begin to take interest in what it means for you to be a black man in America? And you answered that question beautifully. But what I wanted us to arrive at was this juncture right here, where you're like, hold on, I need to know how to fill these shoes properly as myself. When you talk about the DAP, how you wear your clothes, how you present in the community, I'm very interested in how you answer those questions of self-identity. Go ahead.
Well, that's a great question as well. And I think it's one of the most important questions for interracial adoptees to get asked.
Yeah.
For me, my peer group was extremely influential in how I chose to present as a black man in society. Because, when I was 13, 14 years old, I didn't know, even down to sometimes like what the proper lotions to use for my skin were. I didn't know, like I said, hair, and I didn't know how to dap yet and everything. And I was a huge fan of music. So
hold on. Let me ask you something, man. Were you putting gel in your hair? Gel and mousse?
I was not at that time. No, not at that time.
All right. When were you? All right. Let's cut to the chase. When were you? Hold on. When were you putting gel and mousse in your hair and fumbling your dap all crazy? Talk about it.
Oh, man. That was definitely like 14, 15, I think, for me.
Yeah.
And so it took a while. There was a lot of awkwardness that went along with that. But they said, no, man, that's completely wrong. Like, this is how you do it. Mm-hmm. And so I learned how to do it. And I learned that there were different ways to be to understand what it means to be black and to be comfortable in your own skin than just learning about the history. But I also learned that it was okay to be myself too, right? I learned that it was okay to be a black kid that grew up in a white household. So I didn't necessarily, and my white parents listened to Motown, but they didn't listen to Sade, for example, growing up. They didn't listen to India.Arie growing up. So I realized that it was okay for me not to know about certain things because I had grown up in a different kind of cultural environment than my peers had grown up in. But I was somebody that was really big on educating myself about things that I was interested in, wanting to learn more about, music being a huge part of that for me. And so even when I was in my high school years, I spent a lot of time listening to the music that I hadn't listened to growing up. And so when these conversations came up with other black people that I was interacting with, I was able to interject and say things. Even though I didn't grow up with the music, I was still able to give some type of opinion. And so I try to tell parents that it's not just about teaching your kids about interactions with the police and about learning about the history of black people in the United States. And that relates to any race of children that you're raising. It also comes down to different types of things that we've defined as cultural traits of an ethnic group of people too, that are often things that are not informed by trauma as well. Because a lot of the things that we talk about historically that we talk about with black people, we tend to focus, and even I did it here to tell that story and talk about resilience, that trauma piece. But it's also important to talk about some of those other pieces too, because those are equally important in describing all of who I am, as well as all of who other people are too.
So this work that you did some of on your own and your family helped you out with as well, and probably some of what your biological family was fighting for in the first place was this idea that being an African American, it's a thing. It's a big deal. It's a lot that goes into it culturally, what it means to be an African American. And I want to raise awareness, or a black man in America. And I want to raise awareness about, inside of this hour on America's Next Motivator, the responsibility of us all to embrace African American culture, understand what it is, understand the soul, the food, the subcultures, the music, the look, the presentation. All of it is relevant. It's not to be forgotten. It's a part of the fabric of America, and we should definitely preserve it. whether you are in a black family, a white family, or anywhere in between, it's important that we have conversations about the history of African Americans. And it's not all police brutality and slavery. There are varying volumes of greatness that we all need to understand and embrace about African Americans in America and black people around the world. It's all of our responsibility. I love that some of it took place in your life, that you went off and you discovered more beautiful things about what it means to be an African American, what it means to be black in America. But it's incumbent upon us all to discover why some people say black is beautiful, why some people have stood to say, no, I'm going to raise my hands and raise my chin at the fact that I am African American. It's a beautiful thing. You wrote a book. What's the name of the book you wrote?
The book is called The Son with Two Moms.
Okay. The process of writing that book, did it flow naturally, or was it a challenge for you?
I'll say both. Both, honestly. You know, it was so the book, you know, to say quickly, I was in a college course at the time, professor named Dr. Kimberly Moffitt's class, and we were asked to write about how we covered a part of our identities. And I remember I went back to my dorm room and I couldn't think of how I covered a part of my identity. So I just wrote about how I sometimes didn't talk about the fact that I had two moms and two white moms in that way. And this was only like a 2 or 3 page paper. And I turned it in and she said, Tony, I want to talk to you after class about this assignment after she had read it. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking that, man, I must have bombed it, got an F on it or something like that. And so she took me inside and she said, what you wrote was really, really interesting. And have you ever thought about writing a book about your experience? And I was only a freshman in college. I was 18 years old. So I looked at her and I was just like, I mean, yeah, but not at 18 years old. You know, maybe when I'm like 55 or something. Right. But 2 years later, I remember I was at my mom's house and I was cleaning the house. And I remember finding my mother Mary's journal. This is a mother who passed away. She had a journal about her first few chemotherapy treatments that she had written about. So I read those first few pages. And then those first few pages really made me feel this wealth of emotion that led me to just start writing. So I began to write a page, and then a page turned into 2 pages. And then eventually I had some chapters going. And so that's really how it started.
What do you feel has been the power of your writing that book? What was the power of it?
For me, I just feel like I unlocked a part of myself that I get to unlock, because when you're writing,
how have people been impacted by that book?
Well, I've heard families say that the book has been very helpful. I've heard adoptive families say that the book has served as kind of a handbook for them on how to raise their children. I talk about some of the things that we talked about here tonight and a whole lot more in the book. And I feel like my experience has really served as kind of one example of one experience that they can connect with that adoptees may be going through. And some of the things they may not have thought that their kids were going through or may have not even thought of is giving them an opportunity to see that and then talk to the kids about it. And I've also had adoptees who've reached out and former foster youth who reached out as well and told me that, you know, my book spoke to them as well in their experience.
That's right. You're speaking to us tonight, man. I want you to know that. What is the legacy? And we're rounding third base here. We got about 45 seconds left in the show. What is the legacy that you intend to leave here on Earth?
I want to be known as a good person, first and foremost. Somebody who just tried to do better for himself, to evolve. I want to be known as someone who left behind things for people to read that helped them examine not only their experience, not only American experience, but the human experience in this world in positive ways as well, if I could do that.
Absolutely. What is survival to you?
People talk about survival having to do with adaptability. That is true. But if you're adapting in ways that are negative, that's not a good thing. So we want to be surviving by adapting to our environments while still holding true to who we are as people that are trying to be good people in this world. And that's really what it means to survive and to keep your humanity is really what it means to survive.
That's right. What is success to you?
Success is doing things that you feel are helping you evolve as an individual, continuing to do those things over the entire life course while trying to pour into others and enrich others' lives, while also taking into yourself positive things and evolving in that way too.
What is greatness to you?
Greatness is not achievement. Greatness is continuing to learn throughout your life. It goes back to that point of evolving. If you can evolve up until the time you have died, then you have been great on this earth.
Absolutely. Tony, I absolutely admire the way that you were able to focus on humanity throughout your life. Not just race, not just relationships in general, but humanity over the course of life. I think that is phenomenal. It prepared you to be a teacher and a trainer. We are giving you your respect today. And ladies and gentlemen, put your crown emojis into the chat. Ladies and gentlemen, put your crown emojis into the chat because we're giving you a crown today while you're still alive to receive it. We are letting you know, letting the world know that you, Tony Hynes, you are America's next motivator.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Cedric, for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for stopping by tonight, all right?
No problem. Take care.
Sir. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Each and every episode of America's Next Motivator is going to have something here for you. All you've got to do, just like you did tonight, stop by and pick it up.